If you really want to understand how Singapore went from this tiny island with nothing to a global powerhouse, you've got to understand the man who built it. But to get the man, you have to go back. You have to look at the crucial moments that made him who he was. Okay, let's get right into it. Picture this. It's August 9th, 1965. It's Singapore's Independence Day. Now, you'd expect massive celebrations, right? But for Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, it was a moment of deep, deep sadness. This man, famous for being tough as nails, actually broke down and cried on national television. So that's the big question we're digging into. Why tears instead of cheers? And what on earth could have happened in one man's life to prepare him to take that moment of total despair and somehow turn it into one of the biggest success stories in the world? Well, the answers are all in the decades that came before this moment. First things first, we have to wrap our heads around the absolutely shocking situation of that day. Because Singapore's independence wasn't some glorious victory they fought for. Nope, it was actually forced on them. Here's the crazy part. Just 2 years earlier, Singapore had voted to join the Federation of Malaysia. But political fights and racial tensions just exploded. Leaders in Malaysia got really nervous about Singapore's majority Chinese population, and they essentially kicked them out. Just like that. And suddenly, they're on their own. A tiny island with no resources, no army, surrounded by neighbors who might not be so friendly. And for Lee Kuan Yew, this feeling that it was all impossible, that was deeply personal. He was the one who believed that joining Malaysia was the only way to survive. So for him, getting kicked out wasn't a victory. It felt like a death sentence. To understand how he faced this impossible challenge, we need to rewind to an entire world fell apart. Let's go back to his youth, during World War II. This period would become, without a doubt, the single most important political education of his entire life. As a young man, Lee Kuan Yew was a subject of the British Empire. You know, an empire he was taught was invincible. But then, in just over 2 months, Japanese forces just stormed down the Malay Peninsula and took the impregnable fortress of Singapore. And get this, the British actually had more troops, but they surrendered. The real impact here wasn't just military. It was a complete psychological shock. I mean, just imagine everything you believed about power and how the world works just being flipped upside down overnight. The masters were now prisoners. For Lee, this wasn't just a defeat on the battlefield. It was the death of his entire worldview. And this gets right to the heart of his transformation. The occupation was unbelievably brutal, and Lee himself barely escaped being killed in a massacre. But living through that terror taught him a fundamental lesson that no university ever could. He saw raw power, up close and personal. You know that famous phrase from Mao Zedong? Well, Lee would hear that later, but he'd already learned its truth the hard way. He saw that the Japanese weren't in charge because they were morally right. Nope. They were in charge because they had the force and the will to make it so. And that cold, practical view of power would define him for the rest of his career. After the war, armed with this very harsh lesson, Lee goes off to Brighton to study law. But his real education kept going, this time in the world of big ideas and political strategy. In post-war Britain, he was surrounded by all these different anti-colonial ideas. He was interested in what Marxists were saying about exploitation, but he was completely repulsed by the brutal, totalitarian methods of the communists. Instead, he found himself drawn to something called Fabian socialism. The basic idea was to create a more equal society, but to do it slowly, through democratic changes. It was practical, not extreme. And he took that practical mindset and started building his network. See, he wasn't just a student. He was a strategist playing the long game. He figured out that Britain's Labour Party was much more likely to let colonies go independent than the Conservatives were. So what did he do? He joined their clubs, he helped on their campaigns, and he started building relationships. He was already planning for Singapore's future, and he knew he was going to need allies right in the heart of the empire. So when he comes back to Singapore in 1950, it's time to put all this experience, the brutal lessons from the war and the smart strategies from Britain, into action. He gets home and finds a political scene that's just deeply frustrating. The local leaders were often way too friendly with the British, and they just didn't seem to have the guts to fight for real independence. So he decided that if a real movement was going to happen, well, he'd have to build it himself. And just look at how he did it. This wasn't just passion. It was a cold, calculated, step-by-step plan. First, he needed the people. So he becomes a lawyer for the trade unions, wins a huge strike, and becomes a hero to the working class. Check. Mass support. Second, he builds a brain trust, his Oxley Road Circle,
with other brilliant guys he'd studied with. Third, he makes a tactical alliance with the communists. Now, he didn't agree with their ideology, but he was smart enough to see they were the most organized anti-colonial group out there. And finally, when Britain opened up voting rights, he saw his opening. It was time to turn all that support into a real political party.
And this was his big realization. For Lee Kuan Yew, power wasn't just some theory in a book. It was about building a real, tangible base of support. He and his Cambridge-educated friends knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed the people, and the unions were the key to getting that support. This was the engine that would drive him to power.
Which brings us right back to the beginning. The man who was crying on Independence Day was no naive idealist. He was a survivor of an empire's collapse, a student of raw power, and a master strategist who spent 15 years building a movement from absolute nothing. All of those experiences forged a leader who was pragmatic, unsentimental, and completely determined to make sure his nation survived, no matter what it took.